Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Smoko podcast. My name is Alexis Armstrong. Nice to meet you. The Smoko podcast is the place to celebrate and highlight women, trans women, and non binary folk working within STEM and trade occupations. So please tune in, take a break, join us. We are on Smoko. And today we are extremely lucky to be joined by the lovely Dr. Heather Jamieson, who is a professor emerita from Queen's University. She has had 22 years of experience working as a professor and researcher in two departments, the Department of Environmental Studies and the Department of Geosciences and Geological Science Engineering. And her specialty has really been in environmental geochemistry. And her research has been specific to the mineralogical controls on the mobility of metals and metalloids, notably arsenic, in mine waste. And so we're going to kind of talk all things mining, tailings, environmental reclamation, mobility. It's going to be really, really interesting. Her research is not only extremely interesting, but it's extremely important because it has a direct impact on public health, public safety, and environmental protection. And so I'm really excited to kind of talk all things mining and reclamation. We're also going to talk about her experiences as an environmental science and geologist and as a mentor because she has had 22 years of teaching experience and being a mentor to both undergraduate and graduate students. So, Heather, it is so nice to see you. Thank you so much for coming onto the show. It is lovely to have you. It's an honor to have you onto the show.
Oh, thanks, Alexis. What a nice introduction. It's nice to be here.
Oh, well, it's true. I mean, that's your resume. Your resume is pretty incredible, and you've done so much, and you've studied so much. And maybe if we could kind of go back to the very beginning. And I read an interview, which surprised me because I always think that when people end up in geosciences and environmental sciences, it's kind of a stumble. They don't really know that these fields exist, and then they fall into it. And I read an interview that you said in high school you had the opportunity to work for a woman geologist who worked at a local mineral exploration company, and she inspired you to become a geologist. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to this experience and the impact that this woman had on you.
Yes, it is. It is a little bit unusual. So I was in high school. I was in a mining town in northwestern Quebec. I didn't really know, like most high schools
Hmm.
students, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I liked science. I liked books. I liked maybe teaching. And this would be 1970. I didn't have a summer job.
Hmm.
And the local mineral exploration company hired for the very first time, they hired a woman. And she was actually, I now realize she was an undergraduate student from
Oh,
Montreal, but of course she was quite a bit senior to me.
yeah.
And the manager, they decided she needed a female assistant for whatever reason. And the manager was a neighbor of ours. And I don't actually know how he chose me, but he asked me, and I thought, oh, that might be interesting. And anyway, I worked for Susan Atkinson, and she was wonderful. She was very passionate about geology.
Mm.
She loved being outdoors, and she taught me a huge amount. But there was another woman too who was part of that summer, and she was a graduate student, a PhD student from the Sorbonne. She was French, so
Okay.
very sophisticated for, a 17-year-old from a
Yeah.
small town. And so the two of them, Susan and Andre, would be sitting on an outcrop and talking about the rocks and just making it so exciting. So they were both truly inspirational.
Oh my goodness, that's so cool. Like it's so different to have that experience early on, and it's kind of testament to how important that is and like how impactful that kind of moment and those mentors can be early on
Hmm.
in your career. And that's so beautiful that you had these two young women. In hindsight, they were fairly young of being like an undergraduate and a graduate
Yes,
student, but that they were the ones that were like teaching you the ropes and having that first
yes.
experience. That's really cool. That's absolutely beautiful. And from there, like meeting them, did you kind of just know you're like, yep, okay, well, these two wonderful women and this French woman, they've made it possible that I'm now a geologist.
Well, they demystified it a little bit, although, having grown up, I knew geologists. Just,
Mm,
of course, they were all men, and a lot of them worked underground, and I wasn't interested in that. So, but they opened my eyes up to the excitement of the science and also the real adventure and fun of working outside.
mm.
It was a wonderful opportunity. So, yes, I knew I was going to university that fall, and by the end of the summer, I knew I was going to study geology.
Very cool. That's fantastic. I love it. And I love that that kind of instilled your field work because we're going to talk about that in a little bit at the kind of middle and end of the interview because your work has been heavily field based for a very, very long time, which I'm excited to kind of talk about a little bit. And in the same interview, what I also found another kind of tidbit that I thought was interesting is talking about sciences back in the 1970s, that this field of environmental science and studies was kind of brand new and it was being marketed towards women and being like a girly science, which I found interesting. I didn't know that that was a thing.
Well,
Yeah, like I didn't understand that part, that it was kind of like this like girly. It's
it
odd.
was, yeah, it was, I mean, I'm speaking about my experience.
Yeah.
So the way it was explained, so during my undergraduate years, and you look at the role models, which are mostly male, and there was a higher proportion of women in the groups I saw in, say, the oil and gas, partly because it involved less field work. There's a lot of
Mm.
office-based work to be done in that area. And then it was actually a new course in environmental geology. It was becoming a subdiscipline, of its own. And some prof said, this might be good for the girls. And I took, as a 23-year-old feminist, I took great offense.
I would
Well,
have
it was
too.
this thing about soft science, hard science,
Yeah.
and I didn't want to be associated with soft science, so I went in an entirely different direction, and I said, no, I'm going to do quantitative thermodynamics, the high temperatures, and I'm going to get as far away from that as possible. Although I did take the course, and it was
Yeah.
very good. But it's interesting because then it took me a long time to get back to thinking, because I did my PhD in on the mineral
Yeah.
thermodynamics side of things.
Yes.
It took me quite a long time to think back, okay, oh, maybe actually this environmental impact of mining is something I can offer something to, and I can take this, the skills that I've learned and apply it in that direction. And the whole idea of a soft science was kind of set aside by that time.
Mhm. No, it was just it blew me away that like it was being marketed as that because I think the whole idea of like a soft science, a hard science is so ridiculous. Like it is
It
all
is.
science, like it is all difficult, it is all research, it's all kind of like cutting edge new discovery and like innovation. But it's funny that eventually you had that full circle moment, and I do love that you were able to take that quantitative base and bring it back to environmental science and kind of marry the two because you can see that in your research that it is all kind of quant based and
It is, but just as we're talking, it occurs to me, and I think about how we teach our students now, both in the sciences and
mhm,
the engineering part of our program. There's some things, I don't think the word soft is used, but there's some things that are really important to learn. Certainly, if you're associated, we might talk more about this in the mining industry and mineral exploration, understanding community impacts and
mhm.
and things that weren't covered in the curriculum when I went through, but now, they're considered very important.
Which is, I think, wonderful that we now have kind of a
Hmm.
step back as an industry
Hmm.
and at university that we're not truly just focused on science. I think it's better that we also have a little bit more communication and kind of sociology, a little bit of community study. Like, I think,
Yeah.
and like legality, I think that's a really good thing and a good foundation that now young geoscience and environmental sciences are kind of understanding. What was it about you said that like mining and environmental reclamation of mining, you said that you're really interested about that. What about that specialty drew you in that you were like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna make this full circle moment?
Uh, there are probably a couple of things, but having grown up in a mining and community that also had a smelters,
Oh, okay.
I could I was aware of both the economic benefits and the environmental impact. So it was a resource town, and
Hmm.
you see that. And, that's where my father worked. That's where my
Yeah.
friends' fathers and sometimes their mothers also worked. But we also witnessed environmental degradation. So I think that personal experience provided
Hmm.
a context, And that was part of it. On the science side, I could see that, many of the things I learned about geochemistry were applicable at, even though the context of my earlier work was around magmas
Hmm.
and,
So
high
cool.
temperature reactions. I could see with like many of the principles and the tools we used were applicable to things that were more what you would call environmental geochemistry, so processes that happen at the surface of the earth at lower temperatures. And it was kind of exciting to
Yeah.
move into something new, a little bit scary and a little bit exciting. Yeah.
It's usually when you found gold is like when it's a little bit exciting and a little bit scary at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think that's very beautiful that you were able to marry the two and bring that to like an environmental aspect of it. And having that lived experience, I think you're so right of having that personal experience of living in coming from a resource town and seeing kind of environmental degradation. Also, the necessary part of mining, especially in
Yes.
Canada, in terms of our economy and in terms of our resources, to see that we need it, but also to see maybe some of the damages that it has created, and to get into that side to be like, how do we fix that? I think that's really important. And I'm looking forward to kind of diving into your research in a little bit. But before we do so, I just wanted to take a step back because I know another huge part of your life has been teaching. And in 2019, you were granted the Rick Hudson Mentorship Award. And I read a wonderful quote that I just thought was so beautiful. And it was talking about your relationship with your graduate students. And you said it was part colleague, part employer, and part teacher, which I just think that you're a fantastic mentor when that's your relationship. Like, I think it was such a beautiful quote. And being a fantastic mentor, I was wondering if I could ask, what do you think are kind of the key characteristics of being a good mentor? How do you become a good mentor to somebody? And then what are the most rewarding and then maybe the most challenging aspects of teaching?
Okay. Let me try to retrieve most of it. I think being one of the things I think of with mentorship is you're a leader, but you really need to listen and you need to be adaptable.
Mm.
And I love working with graduate students in particular. And I think I've supervised somewhere between 70 and 80.
Wow.
And it's just a time, they're making big decisions, and it's a time when the work you're doing with them is going to influence
Hmm.
their future,
Yeah. Their
and they don't all
trajectory.
go in straight lines.
Yeah.
I was just actually reading over some work that a former student had done who was wonderful to work with. She was beautifully organized, very dedicated, loved
Hmm.
working in the field. And when she left Queens, she continued to work in geochemistry for some years. And now she's spending some time to be an artist. I mean, she
Amazing.
always I have
Yeah.
one of her paintings, so it's, I think I'd like to celebrate that. It's
Yeah.
great. But going back to the listening and the adaptability, because there's many important parts of the relationship is one on one, and
Hmm.
people are different. I've had some students that just challenge me to
Hmm.
understand how they learn, how they get to the stage, because there's always this wonderful moment when it's usually often a year in when
Yeah.
it's their project, right?
It
And
kicks
I can
over.
really back off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they got the ownership part of
Hmm.
it when they're not just saying, thinking, well, what should I do now? And is this
Yeah.
okay? And they can make the decisions going forward and take the creative role. And so that's a magical moment. But how they
Hmm.
get there can vary from student to student. And so I would say that listening to them, getting to know people, and I always found, because of the nature of my work, that the two ways I really got to know my students was either going to the field with them,
Hmm.
or for a good 15 years, I did quite a bit of work using synchrotron facilities. There's just one in Canada in
Yeah.
Saskatoon, and there's several in the US that we learn, but it means going on a trip and spending long hours sitting
Sitting
in
in
a
the
lab in
lab.
front of a bank of computers. And
Yeah.
that's when you really get to know each other.
Hmm.
And that was really helpful for me. I think I was a better supervisor if I made
Could spend
sure
some
I had that
time.
experience with the students.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I caught all the threads in your question.
No, I think you did a wonderful job of it.
Good.
And I think the only other part of it would be But maybe it's both the best part and also the most challenging part of it, as like what's the most rewarding. But it sounds like that kick of like when they have ownership and when they can really take it on sounds
That's really
rewarding.
rewarding.
Yeah.
That's really rewarding, yeah.
And any kind of challenges, or is the challenge maybe just trying to figure out the individual, what works for them?
You know, I always feel one of my jobs is to figure out what the size of the project is.
Mm.
I come with ideas. And the older they get, the more ideas I seem to have. So I have ideas and things that I think would fit somebody, but they're not all
Fleshed
formulated. You know,
out.
they need to be developed. That's
Yeah.
the creativity of research, right? But I think an important part of my job, especially near the beginning, is to sort of feel, okay, well, this is what we can do. And then maybe if we have some time and opportunity, we'll stretch out in this direction, or something might come along and I say, why don't you try this instrument, or
Hmm.
why don't we? But it's very important not to, because most of the projects, they have to be cut off
Yeah.
because you never answer all the questions because new questions are always bubbling up. So
Hmm.
I would say that's one of my challenges, and that's
Hmm.
something that I think I learned over the years. And I went through a stage not too long after I got into this position where I used to have quite a few graduate students. So I learned very quickly that personally at that stage what makes a good thesis
Yeah.
and what suits the person and what's going to be an important contribution. Sometimes you can't always predict that, but
No.
I think the
Yeah.
nature of the work I did is applied enough so I could usually see, oh yeah, this is going to be really useful to someone.
Oh, completely. Like it's gonna your work and your research and all of your students' research is definitely very applied. So it will always be useful. It will always have impact. But I could see the challenge of being like how to make projects small enough, because I think you can't
Yeah,
answer every single question. And as a
yeah.
grad student, you can't be a grad student forever. Like you do have to eventually get kicked out at some point.
Oh,
I wish you
y-
could be a grad student forever, but unfortunately it doesn't work like that.
well,
Yeah.
yes, and I'm not sure if they all want to be grad students forever. And also the nature of the research I did meant that my students tended to be very employable.
Hmm.
So, it was time for them to get on with the rest of their lives, but often they were invited to,
Keep going.
oh,
Yeah.
hey, here's a nice job for you, which is
Yeah.
going to pay you a lot more than graduate stipend. So, I had to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mm. No, that's wonderful, Heather. And I love that answer. I love the fact that you were able to really, I think kind of the key to being a good mentor, and I think like your testament of it is like being adaptable, listening, and having kind of a one-on-one perspective, that there's no all mentor fits all kind of model, because every
No,
single
not at
person is
all.
so different, right?
Yeah.
And I was wondering if we could switch from kind of teaching these undergrads and graduate students to your research, because I think your research is so cool, and I know a lot of people will be really interested in it and want to learn more because they probably have never even heard of it. Your specialty, it's in environmental geochemistry,
Hmm.
and looking at the mineralogical controls on the mobility of metals and metalloids and mine waste.
Yeah.
And if you're not within this field, I was wondering if you could kind of explain what you do, how you do it, and then why or how does this research and specialty really affect the public? Why should the public understand kind of this concept as a whole a little bit more?
Okay. So, yes, I would say, and this covers, if we have time, we can talk a little bit about some research I did, which wasn't mine waste, but mine waste
Hmm.
has really occupied me most of the time. So by that I mean the usually 90 to 99% of the material that's mined, that's actually excavated
Hmm.
and processed so that the valuable part can be extracted. Somewhere between 90 and 99% or higher
Crazy.
for in
Yeah.
cases of things like a gold deposit
Yeah.
is left behind, usually at the same site. And it can be something like waste rock, which is, pretty coarse rock. Say you have an open pit and you're
Hmm.
you're you're blasting and excavating, and the non-valuable part is what we call waste rock. Or it can be what we call tailings, which means it's been crushed, partly pulverized,
Pulverized.
so
Yeah.
that they can use different methods to extract the valuable part of it. and there tend to be more like sand or
Mhm.
even finer grained. And some of this material is benign environmentally, we'd say. It's voluminous,
Mhm.
takes up a large
A space and like
part of the
amount.
earth
Yeah.
because it's, piles of things,
Wow.
sometimes holes in the ground, sometimes subsidence, a physical part of it. So it's not unimportant.
Mhm.
But the part that I concentrate on is the part that's chemically reactive.
Mhm.
And so it doesn't just, the waste rock or the tailings are not simply stored. I guess the best way to explain it is they tend to leak potentially, and I always use the word potentially, but potentially hazardous or potentially toxic elements to water or windblown dust. I've done some work on windblown dust. So those are two things, dust and water, that they can move around, right? So
Yeah.
they can get windblown or through drainage, surface water or groundwater. They can move away from the storage place, the mine site, and potentially affect ecosystems or even human health. So, what we look at is what concentrations you might
Yeah.
expect in water or dust, what form is it in? Sometimes that's really important. And what controls whether it's going to, stay in the rock
Mhm. Or
or be
leach.
leached to the water.
Yep.
So we look at those controls. That's the controls of mobility that I was talking about.
Mhm.
And that information, and it really depends on a lot of things. Every site is a bit different, every element or metal is a bit different. So the information, the results that we get from this research are useful for I think two things. And
Mhm.
one is remediation,
Yep.
is what's the best way
To fix it.
to
Yeah.
restore or
Yeah.
to clean up as much as is reasonable, remediate a site. And the second thing, which in some ways maybe should have been the first because it governs decisions too, is risk assessment.
Mm.
I'm not a risk assessor, but I think the information we provide is very important for assessing the risk.
Mhm.
And risk assessment is a very important part of the making decisions with
Oh, totally.
remediation, with public information, public health understanding, etc. So those are the two ways I think in which our results can be useful.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more, and I do like that idea of kind of risk assessment because I feel like this type of information and this data that you guys provide and you guys really look at, I feel like it's so important to make the first step. It's really hard to clean up and to do reclamation, right? Like you're
Yeah,
already kind of not at a losing battle, but you've already had some damage and you're trying to catch up and you're trying to bring the system back to kind of a natural level. The first step is kind of risk assessment of being like, what will happen if we drill,
sure.
if we
Yeah,
do this
yeah,
exploration, or if we do this production, or if we use this type of method of extracting the ore, kind of
right,
where are we left? Like what is going to happen, and what does this bedrock look like? What does the water quality look like? To have that kind of baseline information is so important. I was wondering, Heather, if you could speak to how you do your research, because maybe that might be
right,
is how do you even
right,
get to that risk assessment? What do you
right,
actually
right.
do? Yeah.
Okay, well, you develop projects following what's interesting and what's important to know, and what
Hmm.
is, you look for the questions that are unanswered. So I was interested in tungsten.
Mm.
So I've done a lot of work on arsenic, and I can speak to that maybe a little later. But in the recent years, I've been interested in some of these more unusual metals, and some
Okay.
of them are defined by the Government of Canada as critical metals, which are critical minerals, is the phrase they use, which means they're critical for modern technology, including what we could call green technology,
Yeah.
but there also is the potential supply risk. So I've done some work recently on tungsten and antimony, that just to choose two. Well, cobalt is another one.
Cool.
So I went to places where in Canada, so I have done a lot of international work, but the last 10 years or so I've been working mostly in Canada.
Mm.
And I'd find out, oh yeah, there's a big tungsten deposit in this part.
Yeah.
So the field work usually is focused on sampling, understanding context. Really like to get the students involved to understand context. And context means, the physical aspect, the history. We work at abandoned mines. We work at sometimes, not too often, at operating mines. We work at what I call wannabe mines, like advanced exploration projects
Yep.
where, it's known that there is ore there that's potentially valuable, but
We haven't made it there yet.
isn't in production and may never come in production
Yeah.
for various reasons. I do a lot of my work most recently, but not exclusively in the Northwest Territories.
Hmm.
So sometimes the locations are remote. So the context is understanding the geology, but also understanding the physiography of the site. Understanding the human context can be
Hmm.
important too. By doing field work, and if possible, I'd like if students can go more than once, because the first
Yeah.
time they're kind of dazzled by everything and
it's,
they're
it's a
kind of
lot to
focused on
take
getting
in.
the good samples.
Yeah.
And the second time, they may already have some preliminary results. They have a more, better understanding of the research questions, and they can really pay more attention with how they think their research is going to contribute. So that's the fieldwork part of it.
Mm.
That's the once in a while, if I work in a remote location, we only have one shot at going there because it's so expensive and
Yeah.
so difficult. So that's always a challenge. And then we do a lot of analytical work
Hmm.
in labs, most of them, but not all of them at Queen's. Some of them I mentioned that I use synchrotron facilities. So that's a tool that I started using in the early 2000s, and it was quite useful. And so we used to go to one on Long Island, and then we
Mm.
went to one near Chicago, and we've been to the one in Saskatoon. So using different tools to try to answer the questions. I wouldn't say we're developing analytical techniques from the ground up, but we're pushing them, right? We're
Yeah.
saying, oh yeah, can you really
Could we
get
use it?
lower detection limit?
Hmm.
Can you really answer this question, the form of arsenic, say? That's one thing we've worked on. So yeah, and that's fun because then you work with some of the experts
Hmm.
in the field that are analytical
Yeah.
experts, and then they like to see these new problems and see how their technique. So that's sort of the second part of it. But then there's a whole part of communicating your results.
Hmm.
And of course, there's the thesis to be written.
Yes.
There's
Yeah.
the journal articles to be published. There's scientific conferences. And because so much of my work is in the Northwest Territories, and some of it is funded through the government in the Northwest Territories, which has been a great partner, I try to make sure my students who work up there go back and talk to the
Community.
community up there when
Yeah.
they have a forum or when they have a meeting.
No, that's wonderful. And thank you for kind of going through the whole scope of how it works, because I think that's so
Right.
important for someone who's not within this field to kind of understand the steps of it. And I did forget that one aspect of your research is kind of like a mystery and unpuzzling old past mining practices, because some of these mines
Yes.
have been abandoned forever. So some of it's like a culture, like a society going back into history to be like, okay, who was there, what techniques would they have used back in the
Yep.
day? Like there's that aspect of that mystery. When you're talking about sampling and field work, are you guys collecting mostly soil sediments? Do you do a lot of water sampling? How does that work?
Yeah, we do all of that. We collect even rocks sometimes and
Mm.
tailings, dust.
Okay.
With some partners, I've recently done a few studies on windblown dust, and collecting those samples is quite tricky.
Yeah.
Um,
It's hard to collect
and we
dust.
do some work on soil that's been impacted by soil and sediments, lake sediments. So I've done
Mm.
a lot of work around Yellowknife, and we looked at lake sediments from many places there with some of our northern partners. And we've worked on soil that had been impacted by mineral processing operations in the area.
Very
And
cool.
water samples you mentioned, and we do that too. It's always one of the more challenging things because
Yeah. It's
is
hard
to
to get
collect
back
water,
and
and
collect it. Yeah.
sometimes you have to measure things very quickly,
Hmm.
and then you have to maintain the integrity of the sample until you get to the lab. So that all requires a lot of preparation and a
Hmm.
lot of dedication in the field.
Hmm. Which can be very difficult. Like you mentioned, you guys are kind of up in these like remote conditions. One kind of follow up question, just maybe to explain a little bit more. When you mentioned the synchrotron, what is that instrument for someone that maybe doesn't know it? What is that instrument, and what does the data, what does it give you?
Well, the synchrotron is really a very, very powerful source of light,
Cool.
right? Of energy, produces photons, and it requires a facility that you can't have in the basement of a university. You really need a
Specialized.
dedicated
Yeah.
source to provide these very powerful stream of electrons, and then they are tuned using different kinds of magnets and other
Mm.
devices. They are tuned to the energy and to have the characteristics that are suitable for the kind of analysis you do. So there's a lot of materials science,
Hmm.
understanding alloys. For example, recently there's been a huge amount of work done on battery materials for electric vehicles, understanding the compounds that are created and their behavior and their structure.
Hmm.
So we look at individual grains, mineral grains,
Cool.
usually, not
Yeah.
always. Sometimes we look at bulk samples, but I find the best information has come from looking at individual mineral grains. And so we focus this very powerful beam, within what's called a hutch, which is a special room. You can set it up and you're gonna then remotely move the motors so you're looking at different little particles in your sample. And what we find out is three things the way I've done it. One is we find out the oxidation state of an
Okay.
element. So, arsenic is one I've done a lot of work on, and arsenic can exist in different oxidation states in minerals. And so that can provide a lot of insight into understanding whether it's going to be mobilized. But at the same time, and that's one of the amazing things about this instrument, you get a lot of information in a short time. We can map the distribution of elements, arsenic, iron,
Oh, wow.
manganese,
Yeah.
over an area of our sample. So to produce, maps showing how it
Hmm.
varies, and that gives us a lot of insight into what's going on. So this
Hmm.
is solid samples. I should explain I've only used solid samples. And then the last kind of measurement we do is diffraction, which is actually looking at the crystal structure
Hmm.
of the mineral. And to be honest, one of the most powerful things I've done is we have mysteries. We
Hmm.
have, because we're looking at processes that happened, weathering processes that happened at the surface of the earth at low temperature. So the rock that was mined was ground up and then it was left
And
at the
set.
surface of the earth, maybe
Yeah.
for 50 years.
Hmm.
And now you look at it under a microscope, a regular microscope, and you say, oh, that's not the original mineral. Something's happened to it.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to tell what's happened to it. But that's really important to figure
Hmm.
out whether the new mineral, because it's been transformed into something else, is going to release its
Yeah. More
potentially
mobile.
toxic constituents.
Yeah.
So the diffraction, it's X-ray diffraction, but it's done at a micro scale with a very powerful source, has solved a lot of mysteries for us.
So
That's
cool.
that's one of the reasons I really got into this.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, during the pandemic, of course, there were a lot of restrictions, and these facilities couldn't have scientists come and use it in the same way they had before. So we did some experiments actually from Kingston
Mm.
on the synchrotron in Chicago, where my students were on their laptops, and there was a little bit like a video game. They were moving the motors down there in
Uh,
Chicago. I
oh,
mean,
that's
they missed
cool.
out on the experience of
Yeah.
actually going to the lab and meeting the people and seeing the facility, which is very impressive.
Yeah.
But they got the data, and it was pretty amazing. They still
That's
got the data
crazy.
themselves. Yeah,
Whoa. It's like war
yeah,
games. Like that's like out of the movies. Like that's crazy that they
yeah.
were
It
able to
was.
do it.
I honestly wasn't sure how it was going to work or whether we'd have the facilities, and it turned out what we mostly needed was a lot of monitors. 'Cause you look at there's a lot of things going on at once, and you're
That's
measuring different kinds of information. So
yeah.
that's what we really needed, was a bank of monitors so we
And
could
that's it. Yeah.
have so many windows open. Yeah.
Wow, that's really cool. And thank you very much for explaining it and kind of explaining the data. And I was wondering if we, before we kind of talk a little bit about arsenic and yellowknife, because I want to dive into there, but before, so I thought maybe if we could also have a little bit of a description on mobilization, because I'm sure someone out there is like, what the hell is mobilization?
The simplest way to think of it is a mineral dissolving in
Okay.
water. So a stream runs over some old tailings and something dissolves and now it's in the water. Well, we can use arsenic. And now it's in the
Hmm.
water, and so now it's going to travel downstream, or the water might be drunk by an animal or a human, and it's another word, bioavailable. It just,
Yeah.
it simply means it can be taken into the body and potentially cause a problem. And
Hmm.
I always say potential, but it's an important distinction because many people talk about toxic tailings. They're
Yeah.
not all toxic,
No.
and toxicity involves, I'm no toxicologist, but I've hung out with enough to know toxicity involves concentration, it involves exposure, it involves the chemical form. So
Mm.
yeah, we use potential because of course we want to prevent this. So dissolution or just a mineral dissolving is the easiest way. It's not always quite so simple. Sometimes it's just leaching, which
Hmm.
means certain elements are kind of um,
Slowly leaving or
yeah, they're
slowly
slowly leaving.
replaced.
The water
Yeah.
just sort of removes them
Hmm.
from the mineral structure. So that's the mobilization part of it. That's water and minerals, and that's a chemical mobilization, which is what we focus on. So if the water is, what controls it, which is what we're looking at. One thing is pH or acidity.
Okay.
So one of the problems in some kinds of mine waste
It is
is
acidic.
that you get acid
Yeah.
conditions or low pH.
Hmm.
And in many cases, that means increased mobilization because things tend to dissolve more. They tend to
Quicker.
move
Yes,
more
if
when
it's
it's
more
acid.
acidic.
So
Yes.
that's one control.
Hmm.
Another one is the amount of oxygen that's around that
Mm.
can affect the stability of the mineral, whether it dissolves or not. So you have a bubbling brook, which was sort of what I was describing,
Yes.
but you could also have some old tailings at the bottom of a lake. And if it's a bottom of the lake where there's not much oxygen, organic material, then you have a different set of reactions.
Hmm. Yeah, then it's in
So
an
those are two of the important conditions. Yeah.
yeah, and an anoxic condition. And that's kind of bringing it back to the synchrotron where you talked about like different levels of
Yeah.
oxidation of arsenic. You can kind of see that level of it. And
Yeah.
that will have an impact to if the arsenic's actually going to be able to go into the water system a little bit more. If we
Yes.
kind of
Yes,
think
it
of it
will.
in that way. Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting and very cool. And I do think like I'm not a toxicologist as well, but it is sometimes maybe a little bit scary if you're not used to chemicals and if you're not used to kind of natural systems or resources to think all
Right.
chemicals are bad or all elements are bad, to be like, well,
Yes.
they can be potentially. And I know it might sound like
Yes.
a cop out, but it's not. We don't know concentration, we don't know
Yeah.
remobilization, we don't know reactivity, we also don't know if it's bioavailable. There's so many different factors of
Yeah.
it. So I
Yeah.
think that's a good thing to have in the back of our mind, but we do also want to trace this. Where is this arsenic going? How much of it is going into the
Yeah.
water and what is its impact? And maybe this will bring us to the next one is looking at your work in Yellowknife and kind
Hmm.
of the environmental impact of these improper tailings. I was wondering, could you kind of speak to how these levels of contamination have happened in the past? Like, why did this arsenic enter into the system? Why was there contamination in the past? And kind of
Yeah.
how do you fix it? How do you do
Yeah.
reclamation?
Well, in the situation in Yellowknife is
Mhm.
there were two large gold mines, large and rich gold mines. That's really why the city exists, and they're very close to town. They're both closed since the early 2000s. The nature of the gold mineralization meant that it was associated with arsenic, with arsenopyrite,
Mhm.
arsenic iron sulfur mineral.
Yeah.
So to extract the gold, so the story of the arsenic contamination in terms of the impact in the environment is more associated with the processing
Of
and
getting out the ore than the
yeah,
actual
well, yeah,
system.
because
Okay.
it was what they call refractory gold. So they
Uh,
couldn't just add cyanide, which is a very classic way of removing gold because gold is quite inert, but it does
mhm.
dissolve in cyanide. But it wasn't successful. They couldn't get recovery, so they had to oxidize this. They had to somehow destroy
Oh,
this
I see.
arsenopyrite because the gold was in
Yes.
the arsenopyrite
Yeah.
in very,
Small.
microscopic and
Mhm.
submicroscopic particles. So to do that, and so now we're going back to the late 30s and 40s through the early 50s. The technology at the time was roasting, and roasting is heating it up to about 500 degrees.
Mm.
So it's not smelting because nothing melts. It's
Mhm.
just roasting.
Just getting it hot.
The difficulty there is because of, well, lack of pollution controls, really, lack of legislation in part, is that when they roasted the arsenopyrite to make it amenable to
Mhm.
cyanidation,
To
to
then
kind of
put cyanide
destroy
on it
it,
and destroy it. Yeah.
um, the arsenic went, quite a lot of it, especially in the early years, went up the stack because
Oh,
they heated it up and went up the
yeah.
stack and was distributed across the landscape and up to 7 kilograms a day in the early 50s
Wow.
from one of the mines. So Then controls were put in and the technology put in place so there was less.
Hmm.
So when I first went there in 1999, actually, with my first PhD student,
Wow.
we looked at the tailings, and
Yeah.
that was interesting to understand what was there. And, I still think it's important that, well, they haven't actually remediated them yet, but they're about to. And I was curious. I started to understand this process of roasting and releases through the stack. And I wondered if you would see that signature in the
Hmm.
soil. And actually, I can say without naming the person that an expert, and I understand why they said this, said no, it's a highly soluble compound, and it will have been washed out because the biggest releases, as I say, were back in the 50s. It will have
Hmm.
washed out and gone into the lake. Great Slave
Hmm.
Lake is very near both these mines. But of course, then I had to look,
Yeah.
and very quickly we
You
found
found
my
it.
my master's
Hmm.
student found evidence. So that was right near the mine, and then we started to look in the region,
Hmm.
like beyond the mining property.
Hmm.
So I should explain the mine went bankrupt in the 90s, and it's managed and owned by the federal government.
Yeah.
So we started to look beyond the mine leased in the region. And at that point, I started to work closely with Mike Palmer, who's my northern partner.
Yeah.
And eventually, we're now working with the Yellowknife First Nations and
Hmm.
government of Northwest Territories and Aurora College. And we did find the particles up to 30 kilometers away.
It's crazy. Yeah, that's huge.
So sometimes you're the bearer of bad news in a
Yeah.
way. It's very important that people in the community know
They need
about
to
this.
know. Yes, completely.
Yeah, they need to know, and
Hmm.
we talk about risk. This is not something that's easily remediated because it's a
No.
huge area, and
Yeah. And it's a natural
it's
system, and it's also been like years and years of
yes, and so
damage.
it's interesting you mentioned that the years and years. So the current research program that I have, along with Melissa Lafreniere from Queens and Mike Palmer from
Hmm.
Aurora College, and the Yellowknife First Nations are our partners, and we're looking at trying to understand the process of recovery of the
Hmm.
landscape. Like how long will it stay is a
Yeah.
question I'd love to answer. It's a very challenging question. I'm not
Yeah.
sure we're going to find a simple answer, but if we understand the processes, like why didn't the arsenic expert told me a long time ago, why didn't it dissolve and
Hmm.
disappear,
Why
or
is it still in
or
the
will
system?
it, or how long
Yeah.
will it take? And so that's what we're looking at right now.
And Heather, what is kind of the steps available for reclamation? Like I know it's not a simple thing. It's not an easy like within a year you can reclaim this area. It's a huge area. Again, it's this natural system. But what are the steps that you can do to try to fix the problem? What does that look like?
Well, there's a very comprehensive remediation plan for the mine site itself,
That's
which of
wonderful.
course is
Yeah.
is not and I'm talking about the giant mine now. The other mine, the Con mine, has been remediated. It's privately owned. The mine site itself, it's managed by the Canadian government, and there's a variety of measures. There's covering the tailings. There's some of the most contaminated soil will be removed and put in pits.
Okay.
They have some high arsenic buried waste that they're going to, the plan is to freeze it, although there
Whoa.
are some alternatives
Okay.
being researched. Those, and some of it will be restricted access. Now, when you get beyond the mine lease, it's not my decision to make. I mean, I think in the
Yeah.
first instance, the territorial public health people have been conducting risk assessment. They have
Hmm.
been providing information to the public
Yeah.
so people can make their own decisions. We've recently done a garden soil study, which actually that was more of a good news story
Yay.
in some
Good.
ways. We have had a couple of good news
That's
stories, and
wonderful. Yeah, that's nice
the
to see.
the arsenic is much lower in most of the garden soil samples, and that's, I think there's not a whole lot of natural soil in that area, so people buy
Yeah.
bagged soil.
Yes.
Plus, they
Yeah.
dig deeper and they dilute it with the deeper soil, which isn't contaminated. And we think those are the two most easy explanations. One of the communities was concerned about windblown dust, but from the
Hmm.
tailings, which were, as I say, are soon to be covered.
Yeah.
But previous years, they would occasionally,
Be
when the wind
open.
came from the wrong direction, the dust would blow towards the community, and they wanted to know if there was any of the form of arsenic produced in the roaster was arsenic trioxide,
Okay.
and it's rarely found in nature.
It's an
but
easy
that
signature then to be like, this is
yeah,
from the
it
mine.
really was
Yeah.
it was a smoking gun is the best metaphor.
Yeah.
And so the total amount of arsenic in the dust had been measured, but the form of it, and that's something what we can do, the form of it had not been identified. And so we looked at it and we found that, yeah, almost all of it was less bioavailable forms of arsenic. So
Which
the
is nice.
arsenic is
That is
there, but
good.
that was
Yes.
reassuring, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, so it's a very complicated problem. As I say, it involves public health. There's lots of research going on in that direction. It involves, yeah, a community really coming to terms
What's happened and kind of like
with
the
mining
past.
history. Yeah,
Yeah. But again, it might be kind of not doom and gloom, but like it might be a little bit of sad news, right? Like there's going to be a couple wins that you're like, okay, this is a little bit better than what we had thought. This is not
yeah,
less bioavailable, or
yeah,
some
yeah.
studies are going to come back with some good things. But for the most part, it still is looking at trying to reclaim contamination, which is a little bit scary, but it's also so wonderful that this is the impact of your work, that this research and is so valuable to a community, and you need to
Well,
have that information relatively available to the community.
yes, I think, and I hope that's important. I mean, yeah, I hope it empowers people to make their own decisions. And much of this land is the traditional land of the Yellowknife Dene First Nation, and so it's important information
Hmm.
for their, they're very knowledgeable
Yeah.
about the mining history and the impact, and so we can add to information that they can use to make their own decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, to help the community. No, I think that's wonderful, Heather, and thank you for kind of walking through your work up in Yellowknife. And I was wondering if I could ask kind of your opinion of the future when we're looking at tailings and environmental reclamation. Where do you think that we need to go? What would be your future hopes of this space? What do you think it would look like?
I think for most new mines and operating mines, there's a huge increase in awareness, in legislation, in pressure, and importantly, in technical understanding of how to contain, how to prevent too,
Yeah.
and remediate. So that's great. I think most operating and new mines in many countries, there's still physical disturbance, but
Yeah.
they can mitigate the environmental impact. There are some outstanding problems. We have tens, probably hundreds of thousands of abandoned mines
Wow.
in Canada. And, I've worked at a few. I mean, I'm talking about the giant mine near Yellowknife
Yeah.
and the Cantung mine. Those are managed and being taken care of. There are many that are simply abandoned. Some of them are not a problem, some of them are.
Mhm.
That's one consideration. Other kinds, if you really step back and look at mining globally, there's a whole issue, and that's not one I've worked on, but it's one I teach about when I can, because it's so important, of artisanal or informal mining,
Ooh.
where mining is done by individuals or sometimes family or small groups using limited technology.
Oh
You've
no.
probably heard about places
Yeah.
in the West Africa and in the Amazon, but many other places. And in fact, as a significant amount of the world's gold
Mhm.
and gemstones and diamonds are mined this way. So it's really important that this is their livelihood, if that conditions are safe
Mhm.
and equitable for that kind of mining.
Yeah.
There's things like deep sea mining just in the newspapers today.
Yeah, that's
People are
another one.
talking about, the resources there are considerable. The deep sea bed is something we don't know very much about.
No.
So there's a lot of concern, I
Mhm.
think, and that concern about the idea of doing any deep sea mining at all is valid.
Mhm.
So there are some areas that really require a lot of new information, a lot of decision making. I think a lot of people think mining is not part of their life. The
And it
products of mining are very
yes,
much part of your
yes,
life, right?
exactly. Whether you know it or not,
Yep,
unfortunately, it's kinda, and your opinion, whether you are for it, against it, whether your
yep.
opinion is, you use it. It's part of your
You
everyday
use it.
life.
So
Yes.
I think it's useful to be mindful of the fact of where things come from. So that, which
Mhm.
actually brings up something else, which is, also has aspects of environmental geochemistry, which is the whole recycling.
Yeah.
aspect. And another thing I was just talking to a colleague of mine yesterday about is, maybe some of these waste piles that are just sitting there, maybe they have value. Maybe now we could get more out of them, or
Yes.
maybe they
Yeah.
have elements there that the people who operated the mine were not recovering because they
They were
weren't that
our
important,
waste.
but now they
Yeah.
are.
Yes.
So there's, that could be part of what they call a circular economy.
Hmm.
So there are some very exciting new avenues there, I think, to explore.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer, Heather, and thank you so much because I do. There's a lot that's just unsure, and like we're unsure of like where we're gonna go. Like you said, like deep sea
Mm,
mining is a whole new kind of resource that might be available to us. But then the question is, should we use that resource, and what is the risk of it? What is kind of going to be the environmental impact, and how are we
mhm.
going to extract that material? I mean, I think that's still very, very new, very unsure. We just don't really know how it's going to work. And then I do think that there's a lot of excitement and I think ability to have innovation in terms of like circular economy. And I think one thing that I always love, or one story in gold mining, to be like, yeah, we just start digging up the road because you're like, the road was made with all of the waste rock. And now we have a new technology and a new system that we can actually extract more value out of it. So I think that kind of having that new lens of new technology and new processes
Mhm.
available to us in natural resources is exciting, but also from an environmental side, I think it could be a good thing that we're kind of reusing something that we've already
Yeah.
not contaminated, but we've already messed up to a certain extent, a natural system that we've already had our hands in it a little bit.
Yes, no, I
Yeah.
understand what you mean. Where it can work, and with the right incentives and
Hmm.
I think the scope is indeed exciting, and we need to do the research to figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the kind of the first step. And Heather, thank you so much. I just want to end it on one kind of last question. And it's more of a general question, but looking back at your career and being an environmental scientist and a geologist, I was wondering if you could kind of speak to like maybe what's something that's kind of unexpected that you just didn't imagine when you first started back in high school that you were like, yeah, this is where I'm going to go. What's been something that along the way you just had no idea it was going to happen?
Hmm. I mean, I always say working with graduate students in particular has been
Mm.
extremely rewarding. Another thing that I think would be unexpected, maybe not back in high school, but probably as an undergraduate, is when I got this particular position at Queen's,
Hmm.
it was when the School of Environmental Studies was created,
Hmm.
and so the position was 50% there. And so as a result, I spent 22 years working with
Wow.
and because it's environmental studies,
Yeah.
people are looking. There are philosophers, sociologists, economists, historians,
So
um,
cool.
toxicologists too, which
Yeah.
is always important. Other scientists in that school. That really opened my mind
Mm.
to other ways of doing research, but other ways of developing research questions. And I was really grateful for that opportunity. It would have been very different, I think. And I supervise students in that area too. It would have been very different if I had been just in the geology department. So that was unexpected. But I think being a geologist, and this probably started early on, it does bring a perspective when you think about Earth
Hmm.
history. And I work a lot on modern, recent
Modern day rocks.
processes, but
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
field,
Yeah.
you know,
Is old.
covers billions of years, right?
Yes.
And sometimes lately, I've been talking to little kids in the local
Mm.
park about the Earth history of the region,
Ah.
and then I was talking to environmental studies students who were none of them had a geology background about extinction,
Mm.
and the pattern of extinction
Yeah.
in Earth history. And I think it's quite a privilege actually to have that perspective to look at, well, the whole planet, beyond the planet too, but
Yeah.
and understand that humans put very
Small.
small
Yeah.
history we have
Yeah.
on this planet. We have influenced the planet, but the planet will carry on.
Yes. Yeah.
And yeah, to know that we're part of this very rich history
Hmm.
of
Of the
this
world,
particular of
planet.
Earth. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good point. And I do think that it is kind of this cool, interesting perspective. And yeah, a privilege to learn that and to have that in your mind. But I do think that it makes you realize how maybe insignificant we are humans. You know what I mean? I think it keeps you humble in a way of being like, okay, this just represents a very small part of Earth history.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of it grounds you in a sense, and I think it's just a different way of thinking. And I do love that answer of something that was maybe unexpected was the environmental studies aspect
Oh,
of
yeah.
working
That
with
was
other
very enriching.
disciplines.
Yeah.
Like I could see that of just being I kind of wish that I had that in my history, in my education, because I think it's so important to get other people's perspective, but also maybe even if we are insignificant, we do have some impact, and to understand a little bit more on policy or on
Yeah.
history or have a more holistic view of environment. I think that is a very good thing for scientists to have. So
Yes, it was. It was really opened my mind.
mm, no, that's so beautiful. And Heather, thank you so much for coming out. I won't take up any more of your time. It's been so lovely talking to you. Thank you for diving into your research and speaking more about mobilization of metals and speaking about arsenic and yellowknife, because I think it's something that people don't realize geosciences and geoscientists look at. I think it's something really important. And I think it's something that more people should be aware of, even if we don't have all the answers, even if it's a really complicated, complex history that you're like, we don't really know where it's going to go or what reclamation is going to look like. But just the fact that we know a little bit more about what's happening to that area is so important and is so important for that community and public health. So thank you. Very long-winded, thank you, but thank you very much for walking through it. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it was so nice to see you. And thank you everybody for listening. This was the Smoko podcast, and we will see you next Wednesday. Thank you again, Heather. It was lovely to have you onto the show. Bye, everybody.